All right. Today we're covering the last concept that we're going to address in this class. This class actually covers a bunch of different stuff. I mean, there's probably more major topics in this class than in any class I teach. So you've all done a great job in sticking with it, and there's not much more to go. So hang in there. We'll get to the end of the semester together. Today the topic is AJAX. And AJAX is a different way of the client and server communicating. So let's first talk about the typical way that the client and server communicates, the way that we have been doing throughout the semester. And I have my diagram here. I'll draw my diagram that I always draw of there being a client who is typically someone running a browser. Doesn't have to be. It could be a bot that's crawling the internet to index websites like Google has or something like that. And this client is connected to the internet. And the client makes requests. They get sent to a web server. And the server responds. Now, we've talked about server-side scripting over here. And we've seen how it can interact with a database. And server-side scripting is typically involved in the preparation of the response. In other words, the server-side scripting is responsible for writing the HTML that's going to be sent back to the client. So you do a Google search for HTML. That request makes it to Google server. Google server does its thing. It runs code that queries the database and so on. And the result is that it will prepare an HTML page just for your request. In other words, an HTML page specific to your location, specific to your platform, and specific to the search term that you've entered in this case, HTML. And that response is sent back to client. So the request comes in, and the server-side scripting is responsible for making a response. Part of the response is going to include HTML, of course, and CSS, and it will also in many cases include JavaScript. And that JavaScript is responsible for interactivity on the page that has been loaded. So things such as, you know, we saw the pull down menus on ESPN's webpage where you put your mouse over a link and a submenu appears, that sort of thing. So now that happens on the client side without going back to the server. So the server is doing the heavy lifting of interacting with the databases and getting the data together. Client-side scripting is responsible for making the pages, giving the pages certain behavior. Now, AJAX is a little bit different than that. In this model, request is made for a web page and the response comes back as a complete web page. So we go to ESPN.com. I don't know why I picked that one. Hope it's like a non-controversial site, I suppose. We go to ESPN. We've requested something from the server. ESPN server queries the database and pulls all these scores and articles and all that and creates a web page for us. So we requested ESPN.com. The server does its thing, queries the database, and prepares us a complete web page as a response. We then have these pull down menus where we put our mouse over something and a menu appears. That happens on the client side because it doesn't go back to the server to do this. All of it is done within the web page that's already been delivered. Now, if we go to Google, we'll see a similar thing where as we search for something, we get back prepared a web page for that. But did you notice what happened on the first screen? As I started typing in my search, in fact, before even I started typing in my search, it came up with a list of recommendations. I don't know who these people are. Apparently they're in the news and they're a popular search. But as I type in J, let's say I want to do a search for JavaScript. I type in J, well, interesting. Google is smart enough to know that because I just searched for HTML, maybe I'm going to be interested in JavaScript. And maybe that's why I typed in J. So I can go and continue to narrow down and select a search term. So let's say I want to type in CSS. So I type in C, it brings up C++, Chrome, C programming language, CSS, and I can pull up CSS. This sure looks like a server-side activity. Why do I say this looks like a server-side activity? Because it's bringing up a list of popular topics based on what I have typed in. And that would be very difficult, if impossible, to do on the client side. The client side doesn't have a database of all the possible search terms that you could search for. Google, however, on the server does have databases that contain the topics that you might search for. And therefore, it's smart enough to, when you first start typing in, to bring up a list. But that doesn't fit the model of getting a whole web page back anytime we talk to the server. In this instance, when we type in something in the server, let's do a search for AJAX. I type in A, brings up that list. J, yep, there it brings up AJAX. All right. There I'm not getting back a full web page. I'm only getting back an update to the web page. And we can tell that because the page doesn't flicker at all. So the page isn't reloading. It's simply redrawing that part of the page. It's part of the page through here. Therefore, this seems to be a different combination of client and server. And it is, and it's called AJAX. In AJAX, you have a different kind of request made to the server. You have an XML HTTP request. This is an HTTP or HTTPS request. This is a different kind of request. And instead of the response giving back a full page, the response gives us back a piece of data. And that data makes it back to the client, and then JavaScript formats that data. So when we type in something in the search bar on the home page of Google, as soon as I type in a letter, a request to the server is made, sending that letter over, and it gets back a list of the 10 top searches relating to the letter A. I type in the next letter, it gives me the top 10 related to the new set of data that I enter in. And that data comes back to the web page in such a way that JavaScript can format it and display this little window. So that is AJAX. The key difference between AJAX and plain old requests are standard requests to the server, give us back a complete web page. Where AJAX only gives us a piece of data, and that piece of data then gets formatted by JavaScript to be displayed on the page. So I made an example based on what we've been doing so far with the heart rate. And let me copy that over to my web server's root directory. Because this is going to involve server-side scripting, I can't just double-click on the files and open them up. I actually have to open them up through the web server. So let's copy all these files over. And you'll notice it's the same thing we had before, except there we go. I have this AJAX, and I've done AJAX two different ways. I've done it just with plain old JavaScript, and I've done it with jQuery. So notice what I'm doing here. When I click on calculator, this is the plain old standard kind of request that we've been seeing all along. This is a page that we had before where I put in my age and I put in my heart rate per 6 seconds and I click calculate and it brings up a brand new web page. Notice the name of the page. This is calculator.php. When I click calculate, it sends it to a different page, checkrange.php. And even if I rewrote this to send it back to calculator page, it would still be a brand new request because I would be getting back a completely different web page. The AJAX version is different though. I go in and I type in my values here. When I click calculate, I don't get a brand new web page. I just get the response back from the server. Calculator with jQuery is the same thing. It just is coded using jQuery instead of plain old JavaScript. So we're not refreshing the whole page. And that constitutes a significant time savings. We're able to call the server and get a piece of data that we need to fill in our web page without having to redraw and rewrite the entire web page. So let's see how we do this. Let's first look at the plain old AJAX version of the calculator page. All right, notice a few things. First of all, our button is not a submit button. So first thing about AJAX requests is we're not using a submit button to submit to another web page. We're going to code our submission to the other web page. We're going to code our new request through JavaScript. When you create a submit button and you make the submission to the new page, you're actually doing a standard HTTPS request. And therefore, you're going to get back a whole web page. So here, we're not doing a standard HTTP request. This is just a plain old button. We're going to handle it via JavaScript. That's the first thing to notice. Next thing to notice, process form. Kind of like before, we validate the form. If the form is valid, then we make our AJAX call. And my validation, I think, just validates the age. It doesn't validate the beats per 6 seconds. Again, I did that probably to demonstrate how it will be handled if I don't enter data. So if I don't enter data, if I don't enter age, it does it this way. If I don't enter beats per 6 seconds, then the server does the validation. Notice how nice this is. This doesn't get submitted to another page. We stay on the same page. And that's advantageous because if we miss some data, we stay on the form where we can just re-enter and correct that. All right, so anyhow, my validation only checks the age. And it probably should do more checks, but again, I didn't, just to demonstrate that there could also be some server-side checking as well. So, if the form is valid, I make my AJAX call. Now, there's a line of code up here. And notice it's outside of any function. And it says var HTTP equals create request object. This is something very critical for the AJAX process. We're creating a request object. That is, we're creating a pipeline between the client and the server. And the request object handles that communication. It's a two-way street. The client can put stuff on that object and call methods on it. The server returns things via that object. So we declare that at the very beginning of the script, so it will be available in any function. It's defined outside of any function. And what this does is this creates a request object specific to the kind of browser. Now, this chunk of code happens to be very old. Very few people are going to be running Internet Explorer these days. Even if they are solidly in the Microsoft camp, they're probably going to be running, what is Microsoft browser called? Shoot, I forget. Edge, that's right. But anyhow, this is there for backwards compatibility. If someone was running an ancient web browser, this would pick it up. So we create our pipeline object and return it to this variable HTTP. So HTTP is our pipeline object. We then make the AJAX call. And the AJAX call consists of two main things. It consists of the request that we're making to the server. That is, what information do we want to send to the server? In our case, we want to send to the server, and that server script that we want to call is called check range AJAX. And we want to send to it the text age and the text beats. And where do we want to send it? We want to send it as part of the query string. So in other words, the query that we want to send to the server looks like this. That's what we want the request to look like. How do I know that? I know that because I wrote the check range AJAX script. Let's take a look at what it looks like. It's going to look for the age on the query string, called age, and the beats on the query string, or part of the request, called txt beats. I'm then going to do my validation, call my function, and return either you're below optimal, or in optimal, or you're above optimal range. Now, I can call that from the browser. In fact, I should do that as a way of testing. So I'm going to type in this. And it tells me I'm in the optimum range, which I am. So the first part of what is in that request object pipeline is the request that we're making to the server. What is the name of the script that we're calling on the server? What values are we placing as part of the form collection, or in our case, the query string? So we form that URL. I'm going to log that so I can look at it and make sure it's right. Because what happens if I spell something wrong? Tells us we're below that optimum heart range. Not really right. All right, that should be within our heart range. Let's see. Am I changing the right code? I think so. Let me copy that, recopy it over to the server. Yeah, I was not changing the right code. I should be getting an error. Tells me there's no value for beats. Beats not a number. Well, I've clearly supplied a value for beats. Well, how are we going to debug that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to log to the console the URL that's being requested. So right here, this is the URL that's being requested. I'm simply going to say console log URL. What does that do? That will display to the console, the JavaScript console, the value of the URL that I entered. And I can look at the console and see that's what the URL that was actually called is. So I can see that that's not correct. So I can make the change. And now when I call it, now when I save it, if I refresh it, I can look and I can see, okay, they're the right URLs being called. That's the first thing that you would want to do in debugging. If it doesn't work out the way that you think it does, make sure that you're calling the correct URL. And the easiest way to do that is to log to the console the URL. Second thing that you'd want to do is you'd want to take that URL and request it to see the output that the server is going to give you. And that does give you the right value. If those two things are working, then the third problem is the way that the JavaScript is displaying the data. So what this is going to do is this is going to call the server using this URL that we've passed it. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to give the server, we're going to give this object a return address. And the return address is the name of the function that we want to get called when the server is done with its work. So this is called sometimes a callback address. You could think of it like a return address on a letter. So when the server is done, this JavaScript function gets called. And in our case, what we're doing is we're making sure that the server is done. That's what ready state 4 means. We can look up there's a list of the ready states. 0 means the request hasn't been sent. 1 means that a request has been called, has been started. 2 means that the send has been called. 3 means that the response is on its way. And 4 means that the request is done. That is, the server is done working on it. So we're checking to see if the server is done working on it. If it is, the response is going to come back in this variable, the response text of the pipeline. So we take that response text of the pipeline and we format it in some way. In our case, we're not really doing anything to format it other than we're displaying it in this span, the results. Notice in this case, the client side has the bulk of the work. The client side formats the request, makes a request to the server, tells the server what script to get called, or tells the pipeline object what script to get called when the server is done. And then when the server is done, it takes the data and formats it. The server has a very simple task. It just does a calculation or whatever. So if you notice, it includes the functions that we had before. It grabs the values from the query string. It does some testing to make sure that the values are correct. And finally, if the values are correct, it calls the function to tell if the heart rate is in the proper range or not. And it returns either a value of you're below, you're in, or you're above the optimal heart range. Now this happens without the server refreshing or sending back a whole page. The server just sends back a tiny piece of data saying it's in the range, it's below the range, or it's above the range. And in that way, the JavaScript can take that response and pop it wherever you want to on the page. In our case, it pops it right here as part of that span. That is AJAX in a nutshell. All right. We send requests to the server in a different way. We send it through JavaScript code, where the JavaScript code is responsible for formatting the request, making the request, and telling the request object what to call when the request is finished. We then have a JavaScript function that takes the response text and does something with it. In our case, we simply display it in that inner HTML. Let's look at the jQuery version. And for your upcoming assignment, which I haven't posted yet, but I'll post it pretty soon, your last assignment of the semester, for that, you can either use jQuery or you can use just plain JavaScript. Functionally, the jQuery one works the same. We put in an age and the heart rate, and we get an answer back from the server. In fact, the jQuery, I believe, calls the same server script as the plain old JavaScript. The difference is how the request is made and all that. It's a lot more cleaner. We say, hey, when this page is ready, set this as the button calculate function. So the button calculate function, which is a button, because we don't have any HTML that says on click, we use JavaScript to assign that functionality. And if the form is valid, then we create our URL. Sort of the same way we did in plain old JavaScript. Then we say make an AJAX request to this URL. And if it works, call this function right here, which simply takes the results and puts it in the results span. So these two are equivalent. This is somewhat simpler code. This is really the nuts and bolts of what happens. Now, in terms of troubleshooting, if you write all this and it doesn't work, how do you troubleshoot? You first make sure that the client is calling the right script. And you do that the way that I did, by doing a console log. You then run the client-side script. I'm sorry, the server-side script that gets called. You run that URL. So you copy the URL from the console and run it and see what the server produces. You just paste it right up on the address line and see what it produces. And if it doesn't produce the right thing, then you can go and debug your server-side script. Finally, if these two are right, then you would look at this function. Gee, is the response text what I expect it to be? You could display the response text to the console and see if that is what you'd expect it to be, and go from there. All right, there's more to AJAX than this. This is a very, very simple example. We're sending a couple fields and we're getting back just a single string. All right. We will cover next week in lecture some more involved examples. The one thing we will not cover, but I think you can see if you combine this lecture with last lecture, You could actually do a request to a database in your PHP script and pull a list of offices maybe that start with a certain letter or that contain the first couple of letters being what you've typed into the text box or so on. We won't have an example like that, but I think it's easy to envision how that would look. All right, that's all I had for this week. We will either see you in lab or we will see you next week in lecture. If you have any questions at all, let me know.